Brennan Ashford came to fix a broken computer. That was all he expected that gray morning in Seattle, when the rain fell in that soft, endless way it always did in autumn, coating the glass towers downtown in a silver mist. He had no idea that within 1 hour, his entire life would tilt sideways, that a single glance at a stranger's screen would pull him into the orbit of a woman the whole business world thought it understood, but did not understand at all. He carried his tool bag over one shoulder, walked into the lobby of Arden Quantum Systems, and thought only about the invoice he would send once the job was done. He could not have guessed that the woman running that billion-dollar company was about to ask him a question that would change both of their lives forever. For nearly 6 years, Brennan had lived a quiet, almost invisible existence. He took freelance contracts fixing corporate networks, patching servers, untangling the kind of technical disasters that made junior engineers panic. He did the work well, charged fair prices, and never advertised the fact that he used to design security architecture for one of the largest defense contractors on the West Coast. He had walked away from that career after his marriage ended, and his son grew old enough to build his own life 2,000 miles away. Brennan did not talk about that chapter. He simply worked with his hands, fixed what was broken, and went home to an apartment that held more silence than furniture. He liked it that way, or told himself he did. There was a peace in being underestimated. Clients saw a man in his 40s with graying stubble and a canvas jacket, and they assumed he was just another contractor pulled from a staffing agency. They never asked about the 17 years he had spent behind classified clearance walls, solving problems that most people would never be allowed to hear about. Brennan preferred it that way. Recognition had cost him too much once before, and he had learned to live smaller, quieter, and safer. That morning, an emergency request had come through his usual channel, marked urgent, paying triple his normal rate. The company was Arden Quantum Systems, one of the fastest rising names in artificial intelligence and cybersecurity on the entire West Coast. Brennan had heard of it, of course. Everyone in the tech corridor had heard of it. What he had not expected was the tension radiating from every employee he passed once he stepped off the elevator on the executive floor. A junior assistant met him near the reception desk, her hands trembling slightly as she handed him a visitor badge. She lowered her voice, as if the walls themselves might report her. She warned him that the computer belonged to the chief executive herself, a woman named Celeste Arden, and that she was, in the assistant's careful words, extremely particular. Nobody who failed her expectations ever returned for a second contract. 3 different technicians had already tried and failed over the past 3 days, and each of them had left the building looking rattled, as though they had walked out of an interrogation rather than an office. Brennan only nodded. He had spent years working under generals and defense officials who did not tolerate excuses, and a demanding executive did not frighten him in the slightest. What interested him more was the technical detail buried in the ticket. The machine was not merely slow or frozen. It was rejecting every attempt at repair, as if something inside it was actively resisting intervention. That kind of problem intrigued him far more than any warning about a difficult employer ever could. He thanked the assistant, adjusted the strap of his tool bag, and walked toward the private office at the end of the hallway, unaware that behind that door sat a woman who had spent years building walls no one had ever managed to breach. The office was empty when he entered, and it did not look like the office of a typical corporate executive. There were no framed magazine covers on the walls, no trophies, no ostentatious furniture meant to intimidate visitors. Instead, there was a simple wooden desk, a wall of windows overlooking the rain-soaked skyline, and a single computer terminal glowing faintly in the muted light. It looked less like the headquarters of a woman worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and more like the workspace of someone who wanted, quietly, to be left alone. Brennan set his bag down and studied the frozen screen for a moment before touching a single key. The system had locked into a strange loop, refreshing itself every few seconds, rejecting every command sent to it. He had seen this kind of behavior only a handful of times in his career, and each time it had meant something far more interesting than a simple malfunction. He pulled a small diagnostic drive from his bag, inserted it, and began the slow, patient work of listening to what the machine was trying to tell him, unaware that in a few short minutes he would be staring at a photograph that was never meant for his eyes. The information technology team at Arden Quantum Systems had spent 3 full days on that same machine, and each of them had walked away defeated. They were talented engineers by any ordinary measure, sharp, well-trained, accustomed to solving problems quickly under pressure. But this particular malfunction had resisted every conventional fix they attempted. They had reinstalled software, replaced hardware components, run diagnostic sweeps that should have caught any obvious corruption. Nothing worked. The system simply refused to behave, freezing at random intervals, rejecting commands, occasionally flashing error messages that made no logical sense given the architecture involved. Brennan crouched beside the terminal and watched the pattern of failures scroll past for several minutes before he touched anything. He had learned long ago that most people rushed to fix a problem before they understood it, and that rushing almost always made things worse. He preferred to watch first, to let the machine reveal its own logic before he tried to impose a solution. Within a few minutes, he noticed something the other technicians had missed entirely, a subtle timing conflict buried deep in the background processes. Invisible, unless someone knew exactly where to look, it was not a virus. It was not the work of some outside hacker probing for a weakness. It was something far more mundane, and to Brennan, far more interesting. Two separate artificial intelligence systems installed on the same machine were fighting each other for control of the same resources, each one trying to optimize the system according to different priorities, each one unaware that the other existed. It was the kind of conflict that could only happen in an environment layered with too much overlapping technology, each department installing its own tools without coordinating with anyone else. He opened a command window, adjusted the resource allocation manually, and rewrote 3 lines of a configuration file that nobody else had thought to examine. The fix took him barely 20 minutes from start to finish, a fraction of the time the previous team had spent failing to understand the problem in the first place. When the machine finally stabilized, the assistant who had let him in stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the screen as if she had just witnessed something impossible. Word of the repair began spreading through the floor within minutes, employees whispering to each other that the strange contractor with the canvas jacket had solved in 20 minutes what an entire department could not solve in 3 days. As the system rebooted for the final time, the screen went briefly black before settling into its home display. Brennan expected to see a company logo, the kind of polished branding every corporate machine displayed by default. Instead, a photograph filled the screen, unguarded and completely unlike anything he expected from the office of a chief executive known throughout the industry for her icy composure. It was a young woman standing in the rain, her hair damp and tangled across her forehead. Her laughter caught mid-motion, as though someone had snapped the picture without warning her first. There was no makeup smoothing her features, no careful styling, no trace of the polished, untouchable persona that dominated every business magazine cover Brennan had ever glimpsed in passing. This was a woman fully alive, in a single unguarded moment, radiant in a way that had nothing to do with beauty in the conventional sense, and everything to do with joy. Brennan found himself staring at the image longer than he should have, caught by something he could not immediately name, some quiet ache buried in the sincerity of that smile. He was still looking at the screen when the office door opened behind him, and the air in the room seemed to change instantly. Celeste Arden entered the way she entered every room, with the kind of composed authority that made junior staff instinctively straighten their posture. She was 37 years old, one of the youngest chief executives in the entire artificial intelligence sector, a woman whose name appeared regularly in industry publications alongside words like formidable and untouchable. Her tailored gray suit, fit with surgical precision, her dark hair pulled back into a style that left no room for softness. Her expression carved from something that resembled patience but was closer to exhaustion, carefully disguised. She had built a reputation over the better part of a decade for being nearly impossible to read, and very few people in her professional life had ever seen anything resembling vulnerability cross her face. She stopped just inside the doorway when she noticed the man standing beside her desk, and for a fraction of a second, something flickered behind her eyes, something between alarm and recognition, before her expression smoothed back into its usual composed mask. Her gaze moved past Brennan and landed on the screen. On the photograph that was never meant for anyone else to see, the image she kept hidden as her personal wallpaper precisely because no one on her staff ever had reason to look at it directly. For one long, suspended moment, neither of them said a word. The silence stretched across the room like something physical, thick enough that even the assistant lingering near the doorway seemed to stop breathing. Brennan understood immediately that he had stumbled into something private, something the woman standing across from him had never intended to share with a stranger who had walked in only to fix a broken machine. He opened his mouth to apologize, to explain that he had not meant to see anything, that the image had simply appeared when the system rebooted. But before he could speak a single word, Celeste crossed the room, stopped directly in front of him, and studied his face with an intensity that made the rest of the office seem to disappear entirely. Nobody in that room dared to look directly at the chief executive's screen. It was an unspoken rule among the staff, one of many small survival habits that had developed over years of working beneath a woman who valued her privacy the way other people valued oxygen. Brennan understood immediately that he had broken that rule without meaning to, and he began to form an apology in his mind, some careful combination of professionalism and discretion that might smooth over the awkwardness of the moment. He never got the chance to say it. Celeste's eyes remained fixed on him, searching his expression for something he could not quite identify. When she finally spoke, her voice came out quieter than he expected, almost fragile beneath its practiced calm, as though the question had been waiting behind her ribs for a very long time and had simply slipped free before she could stop it. "Do you think I am pretty?" she asked. The words landed in the room like something dropped from a great height. The assistant near the door went perfectly still. Two other employees who had gathered to watch the miraculous repair exchanged a glance loaded with disbelief. Unsure whether they had actually heard their chief executive ask a question so uncharacteristically personal, so completely unlike the calculated, guarded woman they thought they knew. Celeste Arden did not ask questions like that. She did not reveal uncertainty of any kind. Not in board meetings, not in interviews, not in the countless negotiations where her reputation for icy composure had become something of a legend across the industry. Brennan did not answer right away. He had learned long ago, both in his marriage and in the years that followed its collapse, that some questions were never really about what they appeared to be about on the surface. A person did not ask a stranger whether they were pretty because they cared about a stranger's opinion of their face. They asked because somewhere beneath that simple question sat a much larger, much older ache, something that had been building quietly for years, waiting for a moment when the walls finally slipped just enough to let it through. He looked past her shoulder at the photograph still glowing faintly on the screen, at the young woman laughing in the rain with no audience and no performance required of her, and he understood exactly what Celeste was really asking. She was not asking whether her face pleased him. She was asking whether that other version of herself, the one captured in a single unguarded moment years ago, still existed anywhere at all, or whether it had been entirely swallowed by the polished, armored woman standing in front of him now. He chose his words carefully, the way he once chose words in rooms where a wrong sentence could cost lives, rather than just an awkward silence. "That photograph is beautiful," he said, "because the woman in it is genuinely happy. That happiness is what makes it beautiful. Not the lighting, not the angle, not anything anyone could manufacture on purpose." Celeste went very still. For a moment her carefully maintained composure wavered, just barely, just enough for Brennan to notice the faint tremor along her jaw before she caught it and smoothed it away. In 7 years of running this company, she had been told she was beautiful more times than she could count, by investors trying to charm her, by reporters searching for an easy headline, by men who mistook her success for an invitation. Not one of them had ever looked past her face to the emotion underneath it. Not one of them had ever noticed that the woman in that photograph was happy, and that the woman standing in this office had not felt anything close to that happiness in longer than she cared to admit. She turned away from him for a moment, composing herself, her hand resting briefly against the edge of the desk, as though she needed something solid to hold on to. When she turned back, her expression had returned to its usual professional calm. But something in her eyes had shifted. Some door left slightly open that had been sealed shut for years. She thanked him for repairing the system in a tone that sounded almost formal, almost rehearsed, and the small crowd of employees who had gathered to witness the strange encounter began drifting back to their desks, whispering among themselves about what they had just seen. Before Brennan could gather his tools and leave, Celeste asked him to stay a little longer. She did not explain why. She simply said the words quietly, almost as though she were surprised to hear herself say them. And Brennan found himself agreeing before he had fully considered what he was agreeing to. The request came the following afternoon, delivered not through the usual channels, but through a personal message sent directly from Celeste's office. She wanted Brennan to remain with the company for a temporary period, officially as a security consultant. Though the specifics of the role were left deliberately vague, the offer surprised nearly everyone who heard about it, including Brennan himself, who had assumed his work at Arden Quantum Systems had ended the moment the computer rebooted successfully. Word spread quickly through the executive floor, and not everyone welcomed the news. Several senior directors expressed open frustration in meetings that Brennan was not invited to attend but heard about anyway through the quiet channels of office gossip. A contractor who fixed broken laptops now had access to sensitive systems, working in close proximity to the chief executive herself. Without any of the vetting or credentials, the rest of the leadership team had spent years accumulating. Some accused him, quietly but pointedly, of manipulating the situation to his own advantage, of somehow engineering his way into Celeste's confidence for reasons that had nothing to do with security work. Brennan heard the whispers and let them pass without comment. He had never cared much for office politics, and he cared even less now, given that his only real interest lay in the technical mystery still buried somewhere inside the company's network. The conflict between the two artificial intelligence systems he had resolved on Celeste's personal machine was, he suspected, only a symptom of something larger. Systems did not accidentally collide like that without a reason, and the deeper he looked into the company's infrastructure, the more that instinct began to feel justified. Over the following days, he worked quietly in a small office near the server room, reviewing logs that most employees never bothered to examine, tracing patterns of activity that seemed, at first glance, entirely unremarkable. It was only when he cross-referenced access times against departmental schedules that something began to feel wrong. Certain files were being accessed at hours, when no legitimate business justified it, transferred through channels that bypassed the usual monitoring software, disguised carefully enough that an ordinary audit would have missed it entirely. Someone inside Arden Quantum Systems was quietly extracting proprietary data, and they had been doing it for long enough to become dangerously confident in their own invisibility. Brennan said nothing to anyone yet. He had learned through hard experience that accusations without proof destroyed careers and reputations just as thoroughly as the crimes themselves, and he intended to be certain before he spoke a single word about what he suspected. He continued gathering evidence in silence, unaware that the answers he was searching for would soon collide violently with his growing, cautious friendship with the woman who had hired him. Celeste began seeking him out more often than the consulting arrangement strictly required. At first, the visits carried a professional pretense, a question about a security protocol, a request to review an unusual login attempt, something that gave her an excuse to appear near his temporary office without admitting the real reason she kept finding herself there. Gradually, the pretenses grew thinner, until she simply appeared some evenings after most of the staff had gone home, carrying 2 cups of coffee and settling into the chair across from his desk, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. It was during one of those quiet evenings, rain streaking steadily down the windows behind her, that she finally told him about the photograph. She explained that it had been taken years earlier, before the company existed in its current form, before her father's illness forced her to abandon her own modest plans and step into a role she had never asked for and never particularly wanted. In the photograph, she was 26 years old, soaked from an unexpected downpour outside a small cafe near the university, laughing at something a friend had said only seconds before the picture was taken. She told him that, back then, she wore no makeup most days, cared little for appearances, and measured her worth by entirely different standards than the ones that governed her life now. She had wanted, at the time, to work in academic research, quietly studying systems far removed from boardrooms and shareholder meetings. That version of her life ended abruptly when her father was diagnosed with a terminal illness, and within 18 months, she found herself thrust into the chief executive position of a company she barely understood expected to project unwavering confidence to investors who were only waiting for an excuse to doubt a woman so young and inexperienced. From that point forward, she explained, no one around her ever asked whether she was happy. They asked about quarterly earnings. They asked about market share and stock valuation and competitive positioning against rival firms. Somewhere during those relentless years of performance and pressure, the woman in that photograph had quietly disappeared, replaced by someone polished and untouchable, someone the industry respected and occasionally feared, but very rarely understood. Brennan listened without interrupting, recognizing in her words an echo of something he had lived through himself. He did not tell her the details of his own collapse, the marriage that ended under the weight of ambitions that no longer matched, the quiet, grinding years afterward, spent rebuilding a life stripped down to its simplest form. He understood, in a way words could not easily capture, exactly what it felt like to lose yourself so gradually that you barely noticed the disappearance until it was already complete. He offered her no advice, no reassurance dressed up as wisdom. He simply sat with her in the silence, and for reasons neither of them fully examined, that silence felt like enough. The crisis arrived without warning on a Thursday morning, when the entire company discovered that a massive breach had exposed sensitive proprietary data to outside parties. The scale of the leak was staggering, threatening not only the company's competitive position, but also several ongoing partnerships with government contractors, who demanded absolute confidentiality as a condition of continued collaboration. Panic spread through the executive floor within hours, board members demanding immediate answers, lawyers preparing statements, public relations teams bracing for a media storm that could permanently damage the company's reputation. Within the chaos, suspicion turned almost immediately toward Brennan. Security footage appeared to show him accessing restricted servers late at night, on dates and times that matched suspiciously well with the timeline of the breach. Several board members, already uneasy about his presence in the company, seized on the footage as proof of exactly what they had feared from the beginning, that an unvetted outsider had been given far too much access, far too quickly, without proper oversight. They called for his immediate removal and threatened legal action that could follow him for years afterward. Celeste found herself standing at the center of an impossible choice. On one side stood her entire board of directors, seasoned executives with decades of combined experience, presenting what appeared to be damning, irrefutable evidence. On the other side stood a man she had known for only a matter of weeks, a contractor with no formal position within the company, whose only real credential in her eyes was the quiet integrity she had witnessed firsthand in the private moments they had shared after hours. Every rational argument favored trusting her board. Every instinct she possessed told her something else entirely. She called an emergency meeting late that evening, gathering the board members, her legal counsel, and Brennan himself into the same room. The tension so thick it felt almost physical. The footage played on the main screen, timestamps glowing beneath grainy images that appeared, at first glance, undeniable. Board members spoke over one another, demanding immediate termination of Brennan's contract and a full investigation into how such a serious security lapse had been allowed to happen under Celeste's direct authorization. Celeste listened to every argument in complete silence, her expression giving away nothing. Though anyone watching closely might have noticed the way her hands remained perfectly still on the table in front of her, a stillness that came only from tremendous effort. When the room finally quieted, waiting for her decision, she looked directly at Brennan for a long moment before turning back to her board. In a voice that allowed no room for further debate, she stated that she trusted him and that the investigation would continue under his direction rather than his dismissal. The room erupted into fresh protest, several directors openly questioning her judgment, suggesting that her personal feelings had compromised her professional responsibilities to the company and its shareholders. Celeste absorbed the accusations without visible reaction, though something in her posture straightened, some quiet resolve settling over her that had not been present moments earlier. She informed the board that she would take full personal responsibility if her trust proved misplaced, and that until proven otherwise, Brennan Ashford would be given the resources and authority necessary to identify the true source of the breach. Brennan requested only one thing before the meeting adjourned. He asked for 24 hours, uninterrupted, complete access to the company's server logs, and no interference from anyone on the executive floor. Celeste granted the request without hesitation, silencing further objections from her board with a single look that made it clear the discussion had ended. As the room emptied and the tension slowly dissipated into the hallway beyond, Brennan remained behind, already pulling up the first lines of code that would either vindicate her trust or destroy everything both of them had quietly begun to build. He worked through the entire night without stopping, fueled by coffee gone cold and the quiet hum of servers that never slept. The footage presented as evidence against him had been altered. He was certain of that within the first hour, though proving it required tracing the manipulation back through layers of metadata that most people would never think to examine. Timestamps could be forged easily enough by anyone with sufficient access, but the underlying file structure left traces that were far more difficult to disguise. Small inconsistencies buried in compression, artifacts, and frame sequencing that revealed exactly when and how the footage had been altered. By early morning, Brennan had reconstructed enough of the deleted logs to trace the actual pattern of unauthorized access across the previous 18 months. Far longer than anyone at the company had initially suspected. The pattern was careful, deliberate, executed by someone who understood the company's security architecture intimately enough to move through it almost invisibly. Whoever was responsible had not stumbled into this scheme by accident. They had built it methodically, over a very long period of time, extracting proprietary algorithms in small, carefully spaced increments designed to avoid triggering any automated alerts. The trail eventually led him to a set of credentials that had been used repeatedly to access the most sensitive research files in the company's possession, credentials belonging not to some outside hacker but to someone deeply embedded within the organization itself. Brennan Cross referenced the access patterns against employee schedules, travel records, and internal communications, narrowing the field of possible suspects until only one name remained consistent across every single instance of unauthorized access. The vice president of technology, a man named Gordon Halsey, who had served on the executive team for nearly a decade, had been quietly selling the company's proprietary algorithms to competing firms for years. He had built an elaborate system of shell accounts and disguised transactions to hide the money trail. Confident that his seniority and long tenure with the company placed him beyond suspicion, when confronted with the evidence Brennan had assembled, meticulously documented and impossible to dispute, Halsey's carefully constructed composure finally cracked, and the full extent of his betrayal came pouring out in a confession that left the entire board speechless. The revelation sent shockwaves through the company that lasted for weeks afterward. Halsey was terminated immediately and turned over to federal authorities for prosecution. His decade of service revealed as nothing more than an elaborate, patient betrayal that had cost the company untold millions in stolen research and lost competitive advantage. The board members who had so confidently accused Brennan just days earlier found themselves in the uncomfortable position of offering awkward, half-hearted apologies, though none of them ever fully acknowledged how close they had come to destroying an innocent man's reputation based on evidence that had been deliberately manufactured against him. Celeste said very little publicly about the entire ordeal, choosing instead to handle the aftermath with the same measured composure she brought to every crisis the company had weathered under her leadership. Privately, however, something inside her had shifted permanently. She had chosen to trust a man she barely knew over an entire board of experienced executives. And that choice had been proven right in the most public and consequential way imaginable. The experience left her with a clarity she had not expected, a growing awareness that her instincts, so often suppressed beneath years of corporate caution, deserved more room to breathe than she had ever allowed them. Several evenings after the scandal finally settled and the company's operations returned to something resembling normalcy, Celeste found Brennan alone in his temporary office, packing away the last of the equipment he had used during the investigation. She stood in the doorway for a long moment before speaking, watching him work with the same quiet focus she had noticed the very first day they met, when he had solved in 20 minutes a problem that had defeated an entire department for 3 days straight. She asked him a question that had been sitting unspoken between them since the very beginning, ever since that strange, unplanned moment when a broken computer had briefly revealed a photograph never meant for anyone else to see. Why? She asked. Had he not simply told her she was pretty that day, the way anyone else in his position surely would have? It would have been easy, expected even, the kind of harmless compliment that cost nothing and pleased almost everyone who heard it. Brennan set down the cable he had been coiling and considered the question seriously before answering, the way he considered every question that actually mattered to him. He told her that in that moment, she had not really been asking about her appearance at all. She had been asking whether anyone still remembered the person she used to be before the company, before the boardrooms, before the relentless pressure to appear flawless in every photograph and every headline. Calling her pretty would have answered a question she had not actually asked, and would have missed entirely the deeper ache sitting underneath it. Celeste stood perfectly still, absorbing his words in complete silence. For the first time in longer than she could remember, someone had looked past the carefully constructed image she presented to the world and had seen, with startling clarity, exactly what she had been silently searching for, without ever fully admitting it to herself. Tears gathered unexpectedly in her eyes, and she made no attempt to hide them. A small but significant departure for a woman who had spent years training herself never to show weakness in front of anyone, especially not in her own office, especially not in front of an employee. She admitted, quietly, that no one had ever asked her that question before. The real question buried beneath her original words, the one about whether the happy young woman in that photograph still existed anywhere inside the polished executive everyone believed they knew. Brennan did not offer easy comfort or hollow reassurance. He simply told her the truth as he understood it. That people did not disappear entirely, no matter how deeply they buried themselves beneath obligation and expectation, and that whatever remained of that laughing young woman in the rain was still there, waiting for permission to breathe again. In the weeks that followed, something in Celeste began, slowly and almost imperceptibly, to shift. She started arriving at meetings without the same rigid armor she had worn for years, allowing small moments of genuine warmth to surface in interactions where she once would have maintained strict professional distance. She laughed more easily during casual conversations with her staff, surprising employees who had worked alongside her for years and had never once seen her express anything resembling spontaneous joy. She began declining certain media appearances that existed solely to reinforce her public image, choosing instead to invest that time in projects that genuinely interested her rather than ones designed purely for optics. The change did not happen all at once, and it was not without moments of doubt. Old habits reasserting themselves whenever pressure mounted or old insecurities resurfaced. But gradually, the distance between the woman in that photograph and the woman running the company began to narrow, the gap that had once seemed permanent, slowly closing with each small choice she made to prioritize her own well-being alongside her professional responsibilities. Employees throughout the company noticed the shift as well, and the atmosphere on the executive floor grew noticeably lighter. The constant undercurrent of anxiety that had defined the workplace for years, slowly easing into something more sustainable. Through all of this quiet transformation, Brennan remained careful never to take credit for the change he had helped set in motion. He continued his work at the company on a formal basis now, his consulting role converted into a permanent position overseeing security architecture, but he never used his proximity to Celeste to seek personal advantage or advance the relationship beyond what she initiated herself. He never pursued her in any conventional sense, never flattered her, never positioned himself as someone deserving of special attention because of what had passed between them. That restraint, more than anything else he might have said or done, was precisely what drew Celeste toward him more deeply than she had expected. She had spent years surrounded by people who wanted something from her, investors seeking returns, executives seeking influence, suitors seeking the prestige of being associated with a powerful, successful woman. Brennan wanted none of that. He showed up, did his work with quiet competence, and treated her not as a chief executive to be managed or a prize to be won, but simply as a person deserving of honesty and respect. In a world that had spent years reducing her to a title and a net worth, that simple, uncomplicated regard felt like the rarest gift she had ever received. 1 year passed, marked by steady growth for the company and a quieter, more personal kind of growth that unfolded entirely outside the public eye. Arden Quantum Systems secured several major contracts that had once seemed impossible following the security breach, rebuilding its reputation through transparency and stronger internal safeguards that Brennan himself had helped design. On the evening, the company celebrated its most significant achievement to date, a landmark partnership that would define the next decade of its operations. The entire executive floor filled with the kind of energy that came only from hard-fought, well-earned success. Reporters gathered for the occasion, eager to capture the traditional celebratory photograph of the chief executive standing triumphantly before the assembled crowd, the kind of polished image that would appear on business publications the following morning, reinforcing once again the carefully curated persona the public had grown accustomed to seeing. A photographer approached Celeste with practiced efficiency, requesting she pose near the company banner for what would undoubtedly become the defining image of the evening's coverage. Celeste declined, politely but firmly, surprising the photographer and several nearby staff members who had never once seen her turn down an opportunity for favorable press coverage. Instead, she quietly excused herself from the celebration, crossing the room to where Brennan stood near the edge of the gathering, deliberately positioned outside the spotlight, as he always preferred to be. She took his hand without explanation and led him toward the private balcony attached to her office, and away from the noise and performance of the party still unfolding behind them. Outside, the rain had softened into a fine mist, the kind that Seattle produced almost daily throughout autumn. Settling gently over the city lights spread out below them, Celeste pulled out her phone, held it up before them, and asked Brennan to simply stand beside her. Nothing posed, nothing arranged, no careful consideration of angles or lighting designed to flatter. She smiled, naturally, and without effort, the same unguarded warmth captured years earlier in that photograph he had first stumbled upon by accident, and Brennan pressed the button before the moment could pass. He handed the phone back to her, and together they studied the image glowing on the screen between them. There was no filter applied, no careful editing, no performance of any kind, simply two people standing close together in the soft evening rain, her smile entirely genuine, his expression quietly content in a way that had nothing to do with cameras or audiences. Celeste stared at the photograph for a long moment, comparing it silently to the one still saved from years earlier, the one that had started everything between them on a rainy morning that neither of them had expected to matter at all. She looked up at him then and asked, quietly, the same question she had asked him on that very first day, though this time her voice carried none of the fragile uncertainty it once had. What did he think now? She wanted to know, looking at this new photograph beside the old one, comparing the woman she used to be against the woman she had slowly become again, over the course of a single transformative year. Brennan looked at the image on her phone, then at her, standing beside him in the mist with rain gathering softly in her hair, her expression open in a way that would have seemed impossible to the guarded woman he had first met beside a broken computer. He told her, simply and without embellishment, that she was not merely pretty this time. She was happy, genuinely and completely happy. And that particular quality, the one no camera could manufacture and no amount of careful styling could fake, was the only thing that had ever truly mattered. Celeste smiled again, the same unguarded smile from the photograph, and stepped closer to him, the rain falling gently around them both as the city lights blurred softly in the distance. The broken computer that had first brought them together had been repaired long ago, its malfunction resolved within 20 minutes on an ordinary autumn morning that neither of them could have known would change everything. But what Brennan had truly repaired, slowly and without ever intending to, was something far more delicate and far more important than any machine. He had helped a woman the world believed was untouchable remember how to festive again. And in doing so, he had found something in himself that he thought he had lost for good as well. Standing together on that quiet balcony above the city, with the soft Seattle rain falling around them and the noise of celebration continuing faintly behind the glass, there was no longer any distance between a powerful chief executive and an ordinary man who fixed broken systems for a living. There was only the two of them, present and unguarded, exactly as they were. No titles required, and no performance necessary. It was, in the end, a beginning far more honest than either of them had ever expected to find. One built not on the polish of appearances, but on the quiet, steady truth of being truly seen.